Well, I'm ready to start the actual lecture now. And there are a couple of loose ends that I have to clear up before the end of the semester. This week I'm going to be covering chapters 11 and 12, but there's a lot of material in the book that I'm not going to be covering in lecture and that I will not be quizzing you on, either on the weekly quiz or on the final, to the extent that the final includes questions from this last week. I'm going to focus primarily on the question of slavery and abolitionism. So what you should do as you're reading those chapters, which have material on slavery, they have material on abolitionism, but focus only on that. The other material in those chapters, there's other material about other reform movements and so forth. You will not be responsible for that, and you will not be quizzed on it, and I won't be lecturing on it. So you'll only be quizzed on the material that I cover in lecture, but the questions, as always, come from the book, so you need to read the book and make sure that you cover that material carefully. One of the loose ends that I have is the Supreme Court decision that I talked about. The Supreme Court decision in the case of Worcester versus Georgia. That was one that I mentioned last block. When Chief Justice John Marshall had to decide a dispute between the state of Georgia and a missionary, a Christian missionary, serving the Cherokee community within the state of Georgia. And the issue that the missionary Worcester raised, was that he did not have to comply with a state law requiring him to get a license from the state because he was practicing in Cherokee territory. The Cherokees had a treaty of 1825 with the federal government. And so Worcester argued that that treaty meant that the land where he was working as a Christian missionary was subject to Cherokee jurisdiction, not to the jurisdiction of the state of Georgia. And this case came before the Supreme Court and Chief Justice John Marshall. Well, I told you that John Marshall was a hardcore, long-standing member of the Whig Party, of the Federalist Party, even after the Federalist Party had gone away. He continued to be an advocate of classic Federalist ideology, that the United States was a single nation, that federal supremacy was always ahead of state supremacy, and that the Constitution needed to be interpreted in such a way as to give the federal government substantial leeway. We talked about this when we were talking about when the debate really came up in the big dispute over the Bank of the United States back in 1791. And Hamilton had presented that position, Jefferson had presented the states' rights position. Marshall was always a Federalist. He was always of the nationalist persuasion. And so this was a case involving a state law or a federal treaty. No question about it, the federal treaty is supreme. So he upheld the position of Worcester, and he basically said that the state of Georgia could not legislate on land that the federal government had ceded jurisdiction over to the Cherokee Nation. So this is a classic John Marshall position of state sovereignty versus national supremacy, and national supremacy always wins with John Marshall as Chief Justice. This case supposedly, and we don't think this literally happened, but supposedly it brought from President Jackson. The case is decided in 1830 when Jackson was president. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And we don't think he actually said that, but he might as well have, because that was his position. His position was on that I don't care what Marshall says, I'm going to do what I think is right. And he said the same thing about the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the U.S. Bank. Jackson said, John Marshall has ruled that the Bank of the U.S. is constitutional. I don't care. I think it's unconstitutional. He was an advocate on both of those of the states' rights doctrine. And he was saying that the state of Georgia had the right to expel the Cherokees, or to take sovereignty away from them. Well, it's a long, complicated story. But Jackson and state legislatures in Georgia and state legislatures in other southern states continued their assault on Cherokee sovereignty over that land that had been granted to them by the Treaty of Washington of 1825. I think most of you know the outcome of this story. It's a pretty well-known event in American history. It's referred to as the Trail of Tears. And I think most of you probably have heard of that in your previous exposure to American history. It's one of the more disgraceful elements of American history. It's complicated. There's laws. There were federal laws. Congress passed laws. Jackson enforced laws that he wanted to enforce. And he would work with the states, and one thing led to another. And eventually the decision was that the Cherokees, as well as the other 4 civilized tribes, had to leave the territory to which they had been granted sovereignty and head out further west to what is now the state of Oklahoma. As they forced that on the Indians, the federal government in some cases made efforts to take the Indians by steamboat up the Mississippi and down I think it's called the Red River, and out to Oklahoma. I have some familiar with the Choctaws. The Choctaws were moved by steamboat, but the Choctaws were comparatively a smaller tribe. The largest of the 5 civilized tribes by far was the Cherokee, and the government decided it's just going to be too expensive to move those people carefully and well, as they had tried to do with the Choctaws. They made no effort to provide them with safe transportation. They simply forced them to walk. The Army was put in charge of this process. The Army contracted with some contractors to provide food and clothing and shelter for the Indians along the way, but the contractors, as is often the case, were corrupt and dishonest. They skimmed on the supplies and basic food that they provided to the Cherokees, and so the result was that on this forced march out of their traditional land, hundreds of members of the Cherokee tribe died. Some of them died of despair. They were moving from a land that they had known for all of their lives to this new uncharted territory out in Oklahoma that they had never visited. They knew nothing about. They knew nothing about the lifestyle out there. It's quite different in Oklahoma than it is in, say, Georgia. And they were just distraught about this. And then they were just not cared for. Their medical care was almost non-existent. And so the result was this disaster, which today is known as the Trail of Tears. And that was sort of the outcome of how, the Supreme Court said that the Indians had the jurisdiction over that land. John Marshall said that, but Andrew Jackson said no, and that's what happened. So as I say, that's one of the more ignominious aspects of American history. That's one loose thread. Now the other issue that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the day, and then in the second lecture, has to do with the status of slavery in the United States. And I've saved this for the end, because in many ways this is the most important issue in this period of American history. The United States has long had a basis of slavery, and we are still paying the price of that experience in our history. That's something that many people, when they talk about the United States as the greatest country in the world, they don't want to address the fact that we have been a nation based on slavery. So I want to sort of conclude the class with as much time as I have talking about the issue of slavery. Now, just to remember where we were, as I said, this is something that we've talked about and I've just sort of left it. It's not concluded. As of the early national period of this country, when we began as a country, we more or less arranged an agreement that we would divide the country into slave states and non-slave states. We actually ended up with a line. It's not just an abstraction, it's a literal line that you can look on a map, and it's a specific line on that map. The line begins in the 13 original states, and the line there is known as the Mason-Dixon line. I talked about that earlier. The Mason and Dixon were two surveyors who'd been hired actually back in the colonial period to survey the boundary between what were then the colonies of Pennsylvania and Maryland. And that line then separated what became those two states. North of that line were 7 states, the states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. Those 7 states all, one way or another, in the early national period, abolished slavery in their states. They weren't exactly rushing to do it. They kind of dawdled. They took their time. Each state did it a little bit differently, some more aggressively than others. They were not rushing to get rid of slavery. There was no great outcry against slavery. There were slaves in all of those states, and their owners were reluctant to see their slaves freed. So this was not exactly like the North is saying, oh, we think slavery is wrong and we're not going to have it in the United States. The fact was that there just were not that many slaves in those states, and they had never been really central to the economy of those northern states. The number of slaves had been relatively small. They were not vital to the economic activity of the state. So it wasn't that big a deal to abolish slavery in those 7 states. So they all did it sort of half-assed, sort of reluctantly, but eventually they got it done. It's complicated. Some states took longer than others. They dragged it out. But they eventually ended up without any slavery. The 6 states to the south of that line, which would be Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, in those 6 states, slavery was more important economically. It's a basis of a difference in agriculture. To a greater extent, Southern agriculture relied on crops that were labor intensive. Not every Southern farmer grew those crops. Many did not. In fact, probably the single most important crop in the South was corn, but there were also farms there devoted to especially tobacco, rice, and sugar in the far South, in Georgia and South Carolina. Those were much more labor intensive than northern agriculture, so there were more slaves there. It's just a matter of an economic necessity. It's not that the North was more moral than the South. It was just that slavery was more important to the economy of the South. And so those states resisted and retained slavery. So from very early in our history, the Mason-Dixon line became, it wasn't designed to be this way, it was not intended to do this, it was simply intended to draw a boundary done by some surveyors between what became two states, but in effect it became the boundary between the North with no slavery, the South with slavery. And that affected the 13 original states. And that more or less worked out that way, and people were basically comfortable with that. That was sort of a solution to the question of slavery. We'll just have it in some states and not have it in other states. Then we had to deal with the territory that we acquired from Britain as a result of the Revolutionary War. The area west of the Appalachians, the area from the Appalachians to the Mississippi, and from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Great Lakes, north and the whole western area of the country. And we talked about that when I talked about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And I told you that there was a great debate in Congress under the Articles. This was like the last thing Congress did under the Articles of Confederation. And at the same time they were doing it, the Constitutional Convention was underway in Philadelphia. So Congress is acting in its farewell gesture to the country, because by the time they passed the Northwest Ordinance, then the Constitution came along and Congress under the Articles was no longer in effect. But Congress put a feature into the Northwest Ordinance that prohibited slavery there. And that was done as sort of a compromise in Congress. We don't know, as I told you when I talked about it, we don't know the details. We sort of understand, we kind of think we know what happened. We know what was going on behind the closed doors. We know that there were some understandings reached there that were not written. But basically the Northwest Ordinance applied to the states north of the Ohio River. And eventually 5 states would be carved out of that territory. That would be Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And when those 5 states, Ohio became a state in 1803, the others were at their time, eventually in 1848, Wisconsin became the last of those 5 states to be admitted to the Union. But because of the Northwest Ordinance, those 5 states were abolished, were off routes to slavery. And sort of the understanding was, the reason we think that Congress could pass that, and eventually that the northern states got the southern states to go along with it, was that the understanding was that the Southwest would become slave states. And eventually there were states there of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and then later Florida, Kentucky, and Tennessee. In those states, slavery was allowed. It wasn't ever really stated, but that's just the way it worked. So we sort of had divided the country along the Mason-Dixon line, and then just sort of an extension. If you look at a map, it's just a little bit of a jog there from the Mason-Dixon line at the end between Maryland and Pennsylvania, and then it picks up the Ohio River, and the Ohio River goes down to the Mississippi, and that is the continuation of the line. So there's a line there that divides the country between the Mason-Dixon line and the sort of the extension of it, the Ohio River. States north of that did not have slavery. States south of that did have slavery. And that was kind of an understanding. That was sort of the way it was, and people were comfortable with that. That's sort of a solution to the problem of slavery. What are we going to do about slavery in the country? We're going to have it in some states and not in other states. Okay.